They say the fog in Carmel by the sea can hide any sin, creeping over the Pacific like a cold, gray shroud that swallows the secrets of the wealthy. I used to believe my life was as clear and unbreakable as the floor-to-ceiling windows of our cliffside estate, a masterpiece of modern architecture I shared with Julian. He was the man I had built a decade of dreams with, a high-stakes venture capitalist whose loyalty I never questioned. But the most dangerous lies are the ones we tell ourselves while staring at a perfect sunset. The nightmare didn't begin with a scream. It began with a silence so heavy it felt like drowning. It began when my younger sister Sienna showed up at my doorstep with a secret that would shatter my reflection forever. Sienna had always been the storm to my calm. While I built a career in architectural design, she had spent years in the shadows of Los Angeles, trapped in a cycle of failed marriages and a desperate, agonizing struggle with infertility. I had watched her soul erode through 2 rounds of IVF, her marriage to a tech executive crumbling under the weight of empty nurseries and drained bank accounts. I was the one who held her hand, the one who sent her thousands of dollars to keep her afloat when her ex-husband finally walked away. I thought our bond was sacred, forged in the fires of her grief. I never realized that while I was looking out for her, she was looking at everything I owned with a predatory hunger. The first cracks in the glass appeared on a Wednesday, a day Julian claimed was dedicated to a high-stakes golf tournament at Pebble Beach I've been acting strange for. Munson explained business trips to the Central Valley and sudden, cold shifts in his demeanor whenever Sienna's name was mentioned. When I told him she was coming to visit, the color drained from his face, and he begged me to postpone it, claiming he needed peace for a pending merger. I brushed it off as work stress, never imagining that the man I loved was terrified of the collision of his 2 worlds. That afternoon, as the mist rolled in, I opened the door to find Sienna standing there, her hands resting protectively over an unmistakable swell in her midsection. The revelation didn't come with an apology, but with a smug, twisted sense of triumph. As we sat in my designer living room, the Pacific crashing violently against the rocks below, Sienna dropped the bombshell that turned my blood to ice. The father of her miracle child was Julian. She detailed a year-long affair that had begun during a business trip to San Francisco, a trip I had encouraged him to take so he could check on her. She spoke of secret meetings in boutique hotels in Palo Alto and late-night calls while I slept just inches away. To her, this wasn't a betrayal. It was a divine gift, a reward for her years of suffering, as if my husband's DNA was a prize she had finally won. But as a designer, I knew how to look for structural flaws. My detective instincts kicked, and when she mentioned Julian's promise to serve me with divorce papers and start a new life with her in a villa in Santa Barbara, something felt choreographed. When I finally forced her out of my house, she didn't leave like a remorseful sister. She left like a woman who had already moved into my life. That night, when Julian returned reeking of expensive scotch and cowardice, the truth I uncovered was even darker than a simple affair. He fell to his knees, sobbing that he never loved her, calling her a desperate, lonely woman who had trapped him. He claimed it was purely physical, a momentary lapse in judgment that resulted in a mistake he wanted to disappear, but I had been recording every word of his disgust for her, every insult he hurled at her character, while trying to beg for my forgiveness. It was captured on my phone. As he slept in the guest wing, I began my own investigation. I bypassed his cloud security and found the financial trail. Julian hadn't just been sleeping with my sister, he had been using her to funnel company assets into offshore accounts, thinking her instability would make her the perfect scapegoat if the SEC ever came knocking. The pregnancy wasn't just a betrayal of the heart, it was a complication in a much larger, more dangerous game of corporate fraud. He didn't want a family with her. He wanted her silence, and now she was carrying the only piece of evidence that could link him to the stolen millions. The finale took place not in a courtroom, but in the same glass house where the lies were born. I invited my parents up from their estate in Bel Air, and I summoned Sienna from her lonely motel room under the guise of a family reconciliation. The tension in the room was electric, a storm brewing inside to match the one outside. Sienna arrived glowing with a false sense of security, believing Julian would finally stand by her side. Instead, she was met with the cold fury of our parents and the devastating silence of the man she thought loved her. I didn't need to scream. I simply pressed play on the recording. The room filled with Julian's voice, not the voice of a lover, but of a man who viewed her as a pathetic mistake, a body he had used. I watched the light die in Sienna's eyes as she realized her miracle was nothing more than a tool in a scheme she never understood. But I wasn't done. I handed Julian the divorce papers, along with a copy of the financial records I had sent to the federal authorities and his deeply religious, I am obsessed family in Newport Beach. In one move, I stripped him of his wealth, his reputation, and his freedom. I looked at my sister, who had traded our bond for a lie, and congratulated her on the ruins of her life. As the police cruisers wound their way up the cliffside road, their lights reflecting off the glass walls, I realized that the fog had finally lifted. I was no longer the victim in their story. I was the architect of their downfall. I walked out onto the balcony, breathing in the salt air, finally free from the ghosts of the house I had built on sand. The flashing lights of the Monterey County Sheriff's cruisers finally faded into the thick marine layer, leaving behind a silence that was louder than the sirens. My parents had retreated to the guest cottage, their faces masks of old money stoicism that barely concealed the rotting shame underneath. They didn't care about the affair as much as they cared about the scandal hitting the elite social circles of Bel Air and Montecito. Sienna was gone, to flaunt out into the night after my father's cold directive that she was no longer a daughter of theirs. But as I sat in Julian's home office, the scent of his expensive Santal cologne still clinging to the leather chair, I realized the victory felt hollow. The financial records I had uncovered were only the tip of an iceberg that threatened to sink more than just Julian's career. While digging through the encrypted drives I had mirrored before the police arrived, I found a series of transfers to a shell company named Ventana Blue. It wasn't just Julian's signature on the documents. There was a second set of initials that made my heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped BIRDMV. Marcus Vance, my mentor, the legendary architect who had bankrolled my first firm, and the person I considered my second father. The betrayal wasn't just inside my marriage. It was the foundation of my entire professional life. Julian hadn't been acting alone. He had been the cleaner for a massive money laundering operation that turned gray tech money from Silicon Valley into white real estate projects along Big Sur. And Sienna? She hadn't stumbled into an affair by accident. She had been sent. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Sienna's years of infertility treatments, her sudden luck in conceiving, it all looked different through this new lens. I found a digital folder labeled Leverage hidden deep within the Ventana Blue files. Inside were photos of Sienna and Marcus Vance in a boutique hotel in Santa Monica. dated months before she ever reconnected with Julian. My sister hadn't just betrayed me for love or a child. She was a pawn being played by a master architect of a different kind. She had been planted in my life to keep Julian focused, to give him a reason to exit the marriage and take the offshore funds with him, but Julian had fallen for the trap too hard, or perhaps he had tried to double-cross Marcus. Either way, I was now sitting on evidence that could dismantle a multi-billion-dollar empire, and Marcus Vance wasn't the kind of man to let a glass house stand in his way. The phone on the mahogany desk vibrated, a nameless number flashing against the dark wood. I knew better than to pick up. But the curiosity of the hunted is a powerful, dangerous thing. When I finally answered, the voice on the other end wasn't Julian's or my father's. It was a woman, smooth, professional, and terrifyingly calm. She introduced herself as Elena, Marcus's fixer. She didn't offer threats. She offered a consultation. She informed me that the police only had what I gave them, and that Julian would be out on bail within 48 hours thanks to a legal team that cost more than my entire cliffside estate. She also mentioned that Sienna had been found, wandering near the Bixby Creek Bridge, distraught and claiming she had lost the baby. My stomach churned with a mixture of nausea and suspicion, whether she had truly lost the child or it was a calculated lie to garner sympathy and witness protection. I didn't know, but the game had shifted from a domestic drama to a lethal chess match. Elena's message was clear: hand over the Ventana Blue files, and I could keep the house, the firm, and my reputation. Refuse, and the structural integrity of my life would be systematically demolished. They knew about the slight irregularities in my own firm's taxes irregularities. Marcus himself had encouraged years ago, calling them industry standard. I was being buried in the very graveyard. I had helped dig, using the tools Marcus had given me. I spent the rest of the night pacing the balcony, watching the white foam of the Pacific swallow the shore below. I thought about the recording I'd played for my parents, Julian's cruel, jagged words about Sienna being a mistake. Had he said them because he truly despised her, or because he was terrified of what Marcus would do if he showed any weakness? I realized then that I couldn't trust anyone, not even the evidence I had gathered. I needed to find Sienna before Elena's team did. Not to forgive her, but to find out if she was still the sister I once loved, or if she was the most dangerous player at the table, wearing a mask of grief to hide a heart of stone. If she had lost the baby, she had lost her leverage. And in the high-stakes world of California real estate, people without leverage tended to disappear into the fog. The drive from Carmel to Big Sur along Highway 1 is a journey through a landscape that feels indifferent to human suffering. The cliffs drop vertically into a churning turquoise abyss, and that night the moon was nothing more than a pale, blurred coin behind the mist. I drove Julian's vintage Porsche, a car he loved more than any person, feeling the roar of the engine vibrate in my bones. I wasn't heading to the police station or a lawyer's office. I was heading to the last place Sienna had been seen, the Bixby Creek Bridge. Elena, the fixer, had said Sienna was distraught, but in our family, distraught was often a costume worn to distract from a knife being sharpened behind one's back. I pulled over at the northern observation point, the bridge's concrete arch rising like a skeletal ribcage against the dark sky. Searching the area with a high-powered flashlight, I didn't find a grieving woman. I found a small, discarded leather notebook wedged beneath a jagged rock, its pages damp from the salt spray. It wasn't a diary, it was a ledger. As I flipped through the pages, I saw my own name, Julian's, and Marcus Vance's, written in Sienna's cramped, frantic handwriting. There were dates, not of doctor's appointments for her pregnancy, but of wire transfers and secret meetings at a private airfield in Salinas. The infertility that had defined her life for years wasn't a medical tragedy. It was a financial black hole she had used to siphon money from our parents and, eventually, from Julian's offshore accounts. The most chilling revelation was a single entry dated 2 weeks ago. Marcus says the architect must fall for the bridge to stand. I was the architect. My sister hadn't just been having an affair with my husband. She had been documenting his crimes to ensure that when the Ventana Blue scheme eventually collapsed, he would go down. And his business partner and wife, would be dragged down with him. She wasn't carrying a child. She was carrying the kill switch for my entire life. The pregnancy had been a biological smokescreen, a way to gain entry into my home and my private servers. As I stood on the edge of the cliff, the wind wicking my hair across my face, I realized that the sister I had spent a decade trying to save Advin, the one holding the match to my world all along. I didn't go back to Carmel. Instead, I drove south, toward the glass and steel fortress in Malibu where Marcus Vance spent his weekends. If the world was going to burn, I wanted to be the one to choose the fuel. The dawn was breaking in shades of bruised purple and orange when I pulled into his private drive. Marcus didn't seem surprised to see me. He was sitting on his terrace, sipping an espresso, looking every bit the visionary leader the Architectural Digest praised. He greeted me not with an apology, but with a critique of my emotional response to Julian's arrest. He told me that in the world of high-value assets, loyalty was a variable, not a constant, and that I should have seen Julian's betrayal coming a mile away. But I had something he didn't expect. I placed Sienna's damp ledger on the table between us. I told him I knew about the Salinas meetings and the Ventana Blue kill switch. I watched his composed mask flicker for a fraction of a second, a structural crack I intended to widen. Marcus tried to pivot, claiming he was protecting me, that Sienna was the loose cannon he was trying to control. He suggested that we could pin everything on Julian and Sienna, making them the tragic figures of a crime of passion and corporate greed, while I emerged as the grieving, innocent widow of a failed marriage. It was a tempting offer, a way to keep my status and my firm. But then he mentioned the baby, how it was a shame. The pregnancy had to be terminated for the sake of the narrative. That was when the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Marcus spoke about the termination with the clinical detachment of a man who had ordered it. Sienna hadn't lost the baby near the bridge. She had been forced to end a pregnancy that was never Julian's in the first place. The dates in the ledger, the secret meetings, Sienna's miracle was Marcus's insurance policy. He had used my sister to infiltrate Julian's finances, and when she became too much of a liability, he had disposed of the evidence. My sister was a traitor, yes, but she was also a victim of a much larger predator. I looked at Marcus, the man who had taught me everything I knew about design, and I realized he hadn't just built buildings. He had built a cage for everyone around him. I didn't take his deal. Instead, I told him that I had already uploaded the ledger to a secure server with a dead man's switch. If I didn't check in every 12 hours, the contents, including his signatures, would be sent to the DOJ. The drive to San Simeon was a blur of salt-stained asphalt and the haunting silhouettes of Hearst castles, towers against the gray dawn. I found Sienna not in a hospital as I had expected. but in a crumbling motel that the tourists overlooked, a place where the curtains smelled of old cigarettes and the Pacific wind whistled through the gaps in the door frames. When I walked into her room, she didn't look like the triumphant mistress who had stood in my living room 48 hours ago. She looked like a ghost haunting her own skin. She was curled on the bed, her eyes hollow, staring at a flickering television that showed nothing but static. There was no medical equipment, no bandages, just a small silver locket on the nightstand that I recognized instantly. It was the one Marcus had given me on my graduation day, a symbol of protectorship that I now realized was a brand of ownership. Sienna didn't speak, but she didn't have to. The way she flinched when I reached for the locket told me everything. Marcus hadn't just used her to get to Julian. He had used her to keep a leash on me through her tearful, broken gestures. The story unfolded without a single word being exchanged. The termination hadn't happened. Marcus had lied to me in Malibu to see if I still had a spark of sisterly empathy left to exploit. If I believed she had lost the child, I might have let my guard down, might have handed over the files to protect what was left of our family. But the child Marcus's biological insurance policy was still very much a reality, hidden away in a private clinic in the valley. Sienna was just the vessel, a prisoner of a man who viewed human life as nothing more than a structural element in his grand design. As I sat on the edge of the cheap mattress, I felt a cold, jagged resolve settle in my chest. I realized that my sister hadn't just been a traitor. She had been a victim of the same perfection I had spent years striving for. Marcus had played us against each other, using her desperation for a family and my obsession with my career to create a divide he could rule. I looked at the ledger I had recovered from the bridge and then at the phone in my hand. The dead man's switch was a bluff, but Marcus didn't know that. I had 12 hours before his fixers would realize I was in San Simeon. I didn't need to save my marriage, and I didn't need to save my firm. I needed to burn the castle down, even if I was still inside it. I began typing a message to Julian, not a plea for reconciliation, but an offer of a different kind of deal. If he wanted to avoid a lifetime in federal prison, he had to give me the one thing Marcus couldn't buy: the encryption key to the Ventana Blue offshore servers. Julian's reply came within minutes, a string of characters that looked like gibberish but felt like a loaded weapon. He was broken, terrified of the men Marcus had sent to visit him in his holding cell. He realized too late that he was the designated fall guy, the one whose name was on all the incriminating real estate contracts, while Marcus remained the untouchable visionary. Armed with the encryption key, I spent the early hours of the morning in that grimy motel room, watching the secrets of the California coastline unfold on my laptop screen. It wasn't just money laundering. Marcus had been bribing state officials to approve developments on protected lands, using Sienna's medical expenses as a front for payoffs. Every beach house I had designed, every luxury villa I was proud of, was built on a foundation of systemic corruption. But the final twist was buried in a personal folder encrypted with a date. I recognized the day I married Julian. It contained a recording from a hidden camera in our first apartment. It showed Marcus and my own father, shaking hands over a bottle of vintage scotch. They had brokered my marriage like a corporate merger. Julian hadn't just met me by chance at an art gallery. He had been selected by Marcus and vetted by my father to ensure that my talent stayed within the family empire. My entire life, the love, the career, the rivalry with my sister was scripted drama directed by two Men who viewed women as assets to be managed. Sienna hadn't stolen my husband. She had simply been moved into a new position on the board when Julian began to deviate from the script. The sun was high over the Pacific when I finally closed my laptop. I looked at Sienna, who was now sleeping fitfully, her hands still clutched around that silver locket. I realized then that I didn't want justice from a system that Marcus owned. I wanted total annihilation. I didn't send the files to the DOJ. Instead, I sent them to Marcus's rival developers, to the environmental groups he had steamrolled, and to the very politicians who were looking for a scapegoat to save their own careers. I lit a match and watched the San Simeon fog swallow the last of my doubts. As I walked out of the motel, leaving the vintage Porsche behind and taking a nondescript rental car, I saw the first black SUVs appearing on the horizon. They were late. The glass house hadn't just shattered. It had turned into dust, and I was the only one who knew how to walk through the ruins without getting cut. 3 years have passed since the glass house in Carmel by the Sea became a crime scene, and then a headline, and finally a cautionary tale. Whispered in the corridors of the Pacific Coast Design Center, I moved further north to a rugged stretch of coast in Mendocino, where the cliffs are untamed and the architecture is built to withstand the elements, not just to look pretty in a magazine. I no longer build for men like Marcus Vance. My new firm, Solstice Design, focuses on sustainable, hidden retreats, places where people go when they truly want to disappear. I've learned that the most beautiful structures are the ones that don't need to scream for attention. Julian is serving a 12-year sentence in a federal facility in Lompoc. Without Marx's protection, his genius for finance was revealed to be nothing more than a series of sloppy digital fingerprints. My father, stripped of his honorary titles and his seat on the board of the Architectural League, lives a quiet, bitter life in a small condo in Palm Springs. The Bel Air estate sold to cover the legal fees that couldn't save his reputation. We haven't spoken since the day I sent him the recording of his handshake with Marcus. Some betrayals are so foundational that no amount of renovation can fix the structure. But the most unexpected development lives only 3 miles away from my studio. Sienna didn't go back to Los Angeles after months in a recovery center. She took the settlement I quietly negotiated for her using the last of the Ventana Blue. Levergant bought a small cottage overlooking the redwoods. And the child, a boy named Leo, he has my mother's eyes and a laugh that sounds nothing like the men who tried to claim him as an asset. He is not a miracle or a mistake. He is simply a boy who likes to collect sea glass on the beach. Marcus Vance is still awaiting trial in a legal limbo that only the ultra-wealthy can navigate. But his empire is gone, replaced by the very rivals he once despised. Sometimes, when the fog rolls in over Mendocino, I see Sienna and Leo on the shore. We don't share Sunday dinners and we don't pretend the past didn't happen, but occasionally we catch each other's eyes across the sand. A silent acknowledgement between two survivors who finally learned that the only house worth living in is the one you build with the truth.